各位朋友，大家好，我是内政部警政署署长黄明昭。人权是所有人与生俱来的权利。一个国家是否重视及落实人权的保障，不但是民主化的基础，也是评估是否进入高度文明社会的重要指标。台湾身为亚洲民主自由的灯塔，政府对于民主、自由和人权不断持续努力，陆续将各项人权标准落实于国内法制中，其能和国际人权接轨，更深化台湾的人权保障。联合国于1948年12月10号通过《世界人权宣言》，指出人皆生而自由，在尊严及权利上均各平等，不分种族、肤色、性别、语言、宗教等不同而有所区别。第5条则明白指出，任何人不容加以酷刑或施以残忍、不人道或侮辱之待遇或处罚。之后，联合国陆续通过了9大核心人权公约，更进一步强化在各方面的人权保障。1966年，通过《公民与政治权利国际公约》及《经济社会文化权利国际公约》，是我们称的2公约。其中，《公民与政治权利国际公约》第7条再次明确表示，不得施以酷刑或残忍、不人道的待遇。1984年，联合国通过9大核心人权公约之一的《禁止酷刑及其他残忍、不人道或有辱人格待遇或处罚公约》，主要议题就在于表彰任何人在任何情况及任何地方有免于受酷刑及其他残忍、不人道或有辱人格的待遇或处罚的权利。此项权利已被视为具有强行法治的习惯国际法。内政部警政署为推动禁止酷刑公约国内法化的主政机关，目前已制定施行法草案送交立法院审议。为及早让社会各界进一步了解禁止酷刑的精神跟内涵，我们特别邀请奥地利维也纳大学法学院 Manfred Nowak 教授录制本部影片。Nowak 教授曾在2004年至2010年担任联合国酷刑问题特别报告员，具有丰富的国际经验，并且曾3度受邀到我国审查2公约国家报告，对我国人权现况有相当程度的了解。这部影片除了介绍禁止酷刑公约的发展、酷刑的定义、国际实务上预防酷刑的做法外，还分享了他担任酷刑问题特别报告员期间实地访查了18个国家的经验，能让大家对禁止酷刑公约有更具体的认识。接下来请大家观看本部影片。
Hi, today I'm talking about a very serious issue, torture. Torture is one of the most severe, of the most brutal human rights violations that can only be compared to slavery. Slavery is ex jure taking away your humanity as a human being. You're degraded to an object. And with torture, the torturer takes away the humanity de facto. It is dehumanizing human beings, and that's why both torture and slavery is absolutely prohibited under international law. They are even forming a norm of jus cogens, that is the highest norm in international law. Even states have not ratified any kind of treaties. They are absolutely prohibited from practicing torture or slavery. I will give a short introduction about what torture is, how it is defined, how we distinguish it from other forms of ill treatment, But then I go into the main ways and means how we can prevent and in fact also stop torture if we want. Every state can eradicate torture if there's the political will to do it. Then I look a little bit at different monitoring mechanisms the international community has established in order to prevent and combat torture. And at the end, I'm telling you a little bit of my own personal experience, having been United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture between 2004 and 2010, but the situation has not changed in the meantime. Torture is defined in the Convention Against Torture of the United Nations, but also in the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court in a similar way. It's the deliberate infliction of severe pain or suffering, physical or mental pain or suffering, on a powerless person for a specific purpose. And that is almost always to extract a confession or to extract an information from this person. You want this person to cooperate and give you the information. It might also be intimidation, might be punishment, discrimination, but the extraction of information is the most important purpose for torture. We have to distinguish the prohibition of torture from the prohibition of other forms of cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. They are all prohibited under international law, but they are less severe forms of ill treatment. So the difference between torture and inhuman treatment is that torture has this particular criteria of the intention, but also the purpose. And that is not for inhuman treatment. So for instance, if you have very, very bad prison conditions, that can be inhuman treatment. It can also be done in a negligent way, in a non-intentional way. So for instance, in my country, in Austria, we once had a drunken car driver who was taken by the police in a very remote village, and they put him in a cell in the police station in order to get sober. And then they forgot him. They forgot to tell the shift that came the next morning. And he couldn't make himself heard. So he was bumping and he was screaming and whatever, but nobody heard him. And then he was really fearing that he would starve to death. He had nothing there, nothing to drink, nothing to eat. He nevertheless survived for 2 weeks. And then a cleaning lady found him and they saved him. But of course, there was severe pain or suffering. It was terrible, both physical and mental pain. It was by a state official, it was by the police, so there's no question. But it was negligent. You cannot torture by negligence. And there was no purpose. So of course these police officers were finally also held accountable, but for him it was only inhuman treatment. So inhuman treatment is also severe pain or suffering, but it can be negligent, it can be without a purpose. For instance, if the police arrests a person who resists being arrested, then the police can use of force. They can physical force, they might also use certain weapons in order to effect a lawful arrest. As long as the person resists the arrest, he's not powerless. So that's why the police can use force, and that might cause severe pain or suffering. That's certainly not torture. Torture always takes place behind closed doors. But it's inhuman treatment if it is excessive use of force. The use of force that is absolutely necessary to effect the arrest or to quell a riot or to a violent demonstration, then it is no ill treatment whatsoever. If it's excessive, then it's inhuman treatment or punishment. degrading treatment or punishment, that is really a very humiliating way. And that is less than severe pain or suffering, but if you treat people in a very degrading and humiliating way, for instance, we had cases where the police then was all of a sudden cutting the long hair of people simply to degrade them. We have in Abu Ghraib, the American female soldiers had the Iraqi Muslim prisoners on a dog leash. That's classical degrading and humiliating treatment. Since torture was so systematically practiced by the Gestapo and the SS, so by the Nazis during the time of the Third Reich in Germany and also in Austria, in reaction to that, torture was absolutely prohibited already in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948, in the European Convention on Human Rights in 1950, in the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, in the Inter-American Convention on Human Rights, in the African Charter on Human and People's Rights. So in both regional and universal instruments, it was absolutely prohibited. But in reality, it continued to be practiced. It was never eradicated. Think about what the French did in Algeria and also in other colonies in the decolonization time. But think about in Europe, we had the Greek military dictatorship in the 1960s with systematic practice of torture. But most importantly, in the late 1960s, but particularly 1970s, there were many military dictatorships in Latin America, so-called national security dictatorships with the support of the United States of America. Most notorious were Uruguay at the beginning of the 70s, the coup d'etat of President Pinochet, General Pinochet, in Chile in 1973, the military junta in Argentina in 1976, and more or less all over the South American continent we had these military dictatorships. And that was the beginning when Amnesty International already in the early 70s published its first global report, world report on torture, where they said about 60 countries really have a widespread practice of torture. And that created very quickly a reaction by the Organization of American States, but also by the United Nations. In 1975, a declaration as a non-binding instrument on torture and other forms of ill treatment was adopted, and that led then to the drafting of the United Nations Convention Against Torture, which was adopted in 1984 and entered into force in 1987. This is not a treaty that is prohibiting torture, because it was already prohibited before. But they said we need new methods to combat torture, and that was primarily fighting impunity. Because in Latin America, they said if the people who torture will be brought to justice, so fighting impunidad, then this will be the best way of overcoming torture. And that's why the most parts of the convention are really to create an obligation of all states parties to make torture a crime under their domestic criminal law with appropriate, fairly severe sanctions. It's one of the most severe crimes, similar to other violent crimes like murder and armed robbery, etc. But in addition, states should not only make it a crime, they should apply all types of jurisdictions. In addition to the territorial jurisdiction, so if torture is applied in Taiwan, for instance, then the authorities of Taiwan have an obligation to investigate this crime and bring the perpetrator to justice. But it's also active nationality principle. If a Taiwanese is torturing others outside of Taiwan, still Taiwan has the obligation to bring these Taiwanese citizens to justice. Most importantly, universal jurisdiction. It was for the first time that the principle of universal jurisdiction, which means that there should be no safe havens for these people who are enemies of humankind, pirates, terrorists, hijackers. We had already earlier this universal jurisdiction, but now it's really in a human rights treaty. So it means that every person who is torturing another person in whatever country is coming then to Taiwan, then the Taiwanese authorities have the obligation to arrest this person, to carry out a preliminary investigation, and then to decide whether they are extraditing the person to another country, perhaps the country of origin where the person comes from, or if they cannot or don't want to extradite, then they have to bring this person before the Taiwanese courts and exercise jurisdiction. That's the very idea of universal jurisdiction. We have most recently now cases in Germany where torturers from Syria, for whatever reasons, they were partly even asking for asylum or for medical treatment, came to Germany. There was a lot of investigation. They were arrested and recently found in a court in Koblenz that they have systematically practiced Syrians in Syria and got a long-term prison sentence. The first famous case was Mr. Pinochet, the dictator of Chile, who came in the late 90s for medical reasons to the United Kingdom, and he was arrested there, although he was senator for lifetime, a former president, etc. And the House of Lords, the highest court in the United Kingdom, decided that he does not enjoy immunity, and that is very important. So he can be brought to justice. He should have been actually sent to Spain, that really has asked his extradition. He was finally, for medical reasons, sent back to Chile. And at the end of the day, he was also brought to justice in Chile, but then he died during the trial. So that is the very idea of fighting impunity by means of criminal law and criminal jurisdiction. Of course, later we also have the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. So if torture is carried out on a systematic level, it's a crime against humanity. If it is done in the context of an armed conflict, it's a war crime that also falls under the jurisdiction. Torture might also be part of genocide. And in Yugoslavia, in Rwanda, in other countries, Sierra Leone, where we had international or hybrid courts, they established in many cases that this was torture and the perpetrators were brought to justice. And the same is, of course, now with the International Criminal Court. Now, that was fighting impunity. The second is preventing torture. And there are various ways and means how you can prevent torture. For instance, already the principle of non-refoulement. No state should send somebody to another state where there's a serious risk that he or she will be subjected to torture. In that case, the sending state is violating the principle of non-refoulement. It's the same as if you yourself are actually torturing. We have all kind of training of police officials, of judges, prosecutors, that there are other ways to get evidence than torturing a person. I mean, as special rapporteur, I found so many poor people in prison because it's usually the police hears and is told that there was a serious crime. And then there's a lot of pressure by prosecutors, judges, by journalists, by the public at large, by politicians, on the police. You have to solve this crime. And the police often doesn't know better than simply arresting somebody that looks suspicious, the homeless, the poor, those who have already committed a crime before. They take them to the police station, they beat them up until they confess. And then they are forgotten somewhere in the pre-trial detention facility. So it's really primarily the poor. It's not the kind of political prisoners that are in a statistical way those who primarily suffer torture. No, it's the poor, the disadvantaged, the discriminated groups, minorities, etc. They are the everyday victims and survivors of torture. So if you then train the police and give them also other ways and means, many police stations don't even have the possibility of fingerprints or DNA analysis. There are so many other ways how you can find out who actually committed this murder or this armed robbery or whatever. So training the police, modernizing the interrogation techniques, also make clear that every confession extracted by torture cannot be used actually in the criminal trial against this person. So that's one of the reasons why there are still many of the suspects of 9/11 are sitting in Guantanamo Bay. And they cannot be brought before ordinary courts because most of the evidence that the investigators have was extracted by torture, by waterboarding and other forms of torture. So if you cannot use them in the court, this kind of evidence and statements are useless. The other ways and means, you should be very quickly brought before a court, you should have access to a doctor, access to family, because torture takes place in the early hours of police custody. So if these kind of guarantees are in place, you can reduce or even eradicate torture. Another more recent way of preventing torture is if an independent body is carrying out preventive and unannounced visits to all places of detention. As I said, torture is always taking place behind closed doors. Usually in a police station, immediately after arrest, they want to have a confession. Or then the person is sent to a pre-trial facility. Again, he is not yet, or she is not yet convicted. So they want to find out, they want to interrogate. So that's the time when it is dangerous. If you have clear legal safeguards that this person should be brought immediately before a judge, then they can tell the judge, no, I have been tortured, and please help me, please release me. We can also have video, audio recording of every interrogation that helps to reduce the risk of torture. And if an independent commission, and I myself have been for many years the head of such a commission in Austria, where we visited during the day and night every police station, and said we want to immediately speak to the detainees who have there any been now people be in disciplinary punishment or whatever. We want to talk to them in order to find out whether they have been tortured or ill-treated. And if you have this right, it has a preventive, a deterrent effect. And we clearly saw in Austria that the police was acting in a more responsible and professional manner. So that is written down in the European Convention for the Prevention of Torture. We have the CPT, the European Committee, that is carrying out regular and ad hoc visits to all places of detention within the 47, now only 46 member states of the Council of Europe, because very recently the Russian Federation, after its aggression against the Ukraine, has been expelled from the Council of Europe. But until that time, the CPT was also going regularly to the Russian Federation and visiting prisons and then writing reports with recommendations. And later, the United Nations adopted the optional protocol to the Convention Against Torture in 2002. And that is even better because we have an international monitoring body, the Subcommittee for the Prevention of Torture. But every state is also obliged to establish a national preventive mechanism. And that's what I was talking before. This is an interdisciplinary body. I, as a lawyer, was the head. But we had doctors, we had psychiatrists, we had forensic experts, we had political scientists, social workers. So it is an interdisciplinary body that goes to prisons, to police stations, but also to psychiatric hospitals, to old people's homes or to children's homes, to migration detention centers, because in all these, when people are deprived of liberty, the risk of being tortured or ill-treated is highest, and these preventive visits have a preventive effect. So the one is fighting impunity, the second is prevention, and the third one is the right of victims of torture to a remedy and reparation. So it means every person, in particular prisoners, should have a right to complain to an independent body and has a right to a quick and impartial investigation. But it's not only complaints, because very often the people who are in detention are afraid. If I complain now, to whom do I complain? To the judge, to the police? And then they know, of course, that I complained about the police, so they will torture me again. So that's why it is important that we are not only relying on the complaint of the victim, but every suspicion by every public authority must lead to an impartial investigation by the proper body. So that means if a police chief or a prison director has some kind of indications that under his or her command torture is practiced, he or she should immediately send this information to an impartial body. That's usually the courts, but it might also be a national human rights institution or other independent bodies. Very often we have a special police. That means a body that is independent from the police but has all the police investigation powers. They can arrest people, they can monitor their communication, their telephones, or whatever, they can search and seizure, even in high-level police officers. So they have all these powers, but they must be totally independent from the police, because otherwise it doesn't work. So that is the right to a remedy, but then if it is established that somebody is a victim of torture, these people often have post-traumatic stress disorders for the rest of their life. Flashbacks, they can't sleep, they get all of a sudden really afraid that something happens again. So they need psychiatric treatment, they need medical treatment, they need rehabilitation. It's much more important for a survivor of torture to have a long-term rehabilitation treatment than getting money compensation. So that is also very important. There is the International Council for the Rehabilitation of Torture Victims in Copenhagen, for instance, and Dignity, and they have all kind of torture rehabilitation centers around the world that are members. Very often it's voluntary work that is done because they are not enough funded. But this is also very important, that the victims finally get a form of reparation. Let me now come also to an aspect that is closely related to torture, and that is the rights of detainees to humane conditions of detention. And again, I want to stress, that's a very important point from my experience. When I come to a prison and I speak to a prisoner who now is serving a 5-year prison sentence, and I ask him, have you been tortured? People often looked into my eyes and said, of course. Everybody in this country who is arrested on suspicion of having committed a crime is tortured. I was tortured 3 days and nights. But that's now 3 years ago. It was terrible, a lot of physical pain. I finally confessed under torture. But the 3 years in prison, in this terrible, overcrowded, unhygienic, inhuman conditions, is much worse than the 3 days of torture before. And that was for me surprising. I knew that there's a lot of torture in the world, but that the conditions of detention in prisons, in psychiatric hospitals, in police detention, in migration detention, are so bad was for me a surprise. That's why at the end was really also speaking about a global crisis of prisons and the crisis of detention facilities. Article 10 of the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights clearly says all detainees have a right to be treated with humanity and respect for their dignity. And it says a correctional institution, as a prison, has the function of the social rehabilitation. So what we want is that the people in prison have access to work, access to education, to recreation, sports, etc., so that at the end of the day, when they are released, they can be reintegrated into society. That helps society because the risk of recidivism is much smaller. If you have a system with retributive justice, where they simply say you have to suffer as much as possible and we lock you away, if these people get out of prison, the risk is much higher that they immediately commit another crime. And that's why countries with a retributive system of justice, philosophy of justice, have a much higher crime rate and a much higher imprisonment rate. Whereas countries like the Nordic countries in Europe that have the highest standards of conditions of detention, where people are in principle free to walk around, they can decide themselves what they would like to do during the day, and they have all the education, vocational training to prepare themselves for a life after prison. They are treated like clients. Sometimes a Swedish director of a prison told me when I visited this prison with my students. And she said, yes, these are my clients, they are not inmates or whatever. I want to treat them as nicely as possible, because then I have to fear less. They are not aggressive, we have not a lot of tension, no violence, they don't want to flee. And they know that they will be perhaps earlier released and can be reintegrated into society. So that's the principle of normalization, as they call it. Life in prison should as much resemble life outside prison. If you go to China or the United States and look at these prisons, then it's exactly the opposite. They are locked away, and it's not a way of rehabilitating them for the crimes that they have actually committed. And if you look at this chart on the global detention situation, you have clear indicators. We have about 10 million on average prisoners in the world, and more than 2 million, so 1/5 in the United States of America. Even more than China, with 1.7 million, which is the country with the highest population. India has 488,000, etc. But if you look, and Taiwan has 52,000, so it's much lower. The real indicator is the prison population per 100,000 inhabitants, and again the United States is on the top with more than 629. So it means in Europe we have about 100 on average. In the Nordic countries, 60, 70 only. So it is almost 10 times as much in the United States. And then you have countries like Rwanda, Turkmenistan, El Salvador, countries with a high rate of crime, Cuba, etc., which have this high rate. Taiwan has 221. This is fairly high. So it's something one really should do something about. So to come down to, even the People's Republic of China has 119, so it's much less than in Taiwan. So that is something where I see there's a problem. The third indicator is the occupancy level. So usually, let's say in Taiwan it's 114%, so it means it's overcrowded already. In the US it's just below 100, but even then you have some prisons that are overcrowded, others less. But in a country like Congo we have 616.9. That means every prison place is occupied 6 times. You can imagine what it means in overcrowding. you have to sleep in shifts in order to, it's totally overcrowded, and that means also lack of food, etc. So we have Congo, Haiti, Guatemala, the Philippines, Cambodia that have a very, very high rate of occupancy level. And the final indicator is pre-trial detainees, the percentage of pre-trial detainees in relation to the overall prison population. There we have Taiwan with 4.8, that's very, very low, 4.6. Actually, that's very good. It means that the administration of justice works very quickly, and people only spend a short period of time in pre-trial detention, and then they are convicted. Because pre-trial detention should really be the exception and not the rule. Other countries have 70, 80, 90. The highest is Libya with 90%, Haiti with 82%, etc. That shows that the administration of justice is broken down. So people are in remand prisons, and they have never been really brought before a court, but they really lavish in prisons, are often forgotten prisoners. So this World Prison Brief, which is a British academic statistics based on, of course, state information, is actually working very well in showing us what are the shortcomings and the strengths of the different systems in the world. Now finally I go to the what are monitoring bodies. Some I already mentioned, but it was also then in the 1980s, reaction to Latin American dictatorships. We have, of course, the UN Committee Against Torture with new procedures like the inquiry procedure, ex officio, etc. Since 1987. In 1985, the Special Rapporteur of the United Nations on torture, a thematic mandate, was established, and it's still existing today. And we have the UN Subcommittee on Prevention that was created in 2006. So I'm now getting to the Special Rapporteur on Torture, and to give you a little overview, it is a so-called thematic mechanism. We have country-specific ones, so the Special Rapporteur on North Korea, for instance, or on Belarus and other countries, is a person who is investigating one country and then the overall human rights situation. A thematic mandate, like the Special Rapporteur on the right to food, or the Special Rapporteur on violence against women, or on torture, they have only one topic, but then for all countries in the world. And that's important. It is established by the Human Rights Council, which is a charter-based body under the General Assembly. And that really applies to all 193 member states of the United Nations, and there might also be a possibility that the Special Rapporteur might visit even a non-member state like Taiwan. These are independent experts. They are not paid. They serve in their individual capacity, and they do, on the one hand, deal with individual complaints, and that's very quick. That if your husband, wife, daughter has been taken to a police station and you feel this is notorious for torture, so you go to an NGO usually and say, what can you do, how can you help me? And they need certain data. When was she arrested? Who was arresting her? Where is she now, etc. And then they send this data to an international non-governmental organization, a national section of Amnesty, to the International Secretariat in London. They check a little bit, we know this police station is quite notorious, and they send it immediately to the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, while I, as a Special Rapporteur, of course, had people working on my mandate. They check it again, and it might be the same day or the next day that I then send out an urgent complaint, an urgent appeal directly to the Minister of Foreign Affairs of that country, and they're saying, that's the information I got, it's plausible information, but I don't know whether it's really true, I cannot investigate, but you have an obligation to immediately investigate these allegations, and then please tell me what you found out within a week or latest 2 weeks. You should report back to me what was the outcome. If you find it's true, these people have been tortured, you should bring the perpetrators to justice, you should release the person, provide rehabilitation, whatever. If you find out it's not true, then again explain to me why, what you did, etc. In many countries that works very well, other countries less. That depends, of course, on the level of cooperation of those states. But an urgent appeal by a United Nations special rapporteur has usually an impact, even if they don't really admit it. We often heard afterwards that the person was released or at least no longer tortured. But most of the work is carrying out fact-finding missions, and that is my last part, that I tried to do as many fact-finding missions I could in those 6 years. I did 18 official fact-finding missions, and I tried to do it on a representative sample. So countries in all regions of the world, but also communist countries and capitalists, big and small, island states, etc., those who are in armed conflict and not, so that I can draw general conclusions that are representative for the world. Because this is about 10%. I did also travel to many other countries, but these 18 official fact-finding missions told me actually a lot. In order to do that, you need an invitation by the government. That's not so easy. For China, it took about 10 years. My predecessor started, and I benefited then, and I was appointed in October 2004. And already in November 2005, I could go to China, including Tibet, including the Uyghur area, Xinjiang, but also Beijing, some political prisoners. So I could do quite a lot in China. Other countries, it's very quick. They have a standing invitation. If I wanted to go to Denmark, I simply met the Danish ambassador in Geneva and said, can I come? And she said, of course, you're most welcome. And we arranged it for the next month. She just has to make sure that I meet the right people whom I would like to meet. So these are my terms of reference. If a state is inviting me, then I say, but you have to comply with my terms of reference. And they are not only freedom of movement and freedom of inquiry, contacts with all branches of government. You usually meet the ministers of justice, interior, security, the chief justice, sometimes the head of state or the head of government, depends on the country. That is organized by the government. But then I say, I am not telling you what I'm doing, I'm not telling you which NGOs I'm meeting, and in particular not to which places of detention I go. And that's where I actually spend most of my time. So if you really want to find out whether there's torture, you have to go to police stations and other places where people are deprived of liberty, but you have to do it in a very efficient manner. That means unannounced visits, and secondly, you have to be able to speak in private, confidentially, with detainees, witnesses, there can be staff or other prisoners, and for that you need a forensic expert. So I insisted to bring a forensic expert with me, because I'm not a doctor, but a doctor can see exactly if a detainee tells I have been tortured and I have marks on the back. The doctor can tell exactly whether this corroborates the evidence. Is it a metal bar or a plastic pipe, whatever, that was used as a tool for beating up the people. Forensic experts always also need a high-resolution camera in order to document the scars, and that's what they found. So they need all kind of equipment, and I said, I also need that. So and that is against the normal standards of prison visits, we brought all our mobile phones, our laptops. I also had always a video camera. If you take a 2 minutes, 3 minutes video of a situation in a prison, overcrowdedness, it tells so much more than 10 pages of reporting what overcrowdedness means. Access to all documentary material. So it was quite tough terms of reference, but all the states that invited me actually complied with that. Otherwise, I wouldn't have accepted the invitation. Fact-finding, then, there are many different methods. As I said, we were always a bigger team. Gender balance is very important. If you do an interview, the 4 eyes principle, one is speaking to the detainee and the other one is taking notes, and then you change it. You have to have also to establish trust between the detainee and you. Then, of course, the NGOs play a very important role. You need to be well informed also by non-governmental organizations. What are the most notorious detention centers, etc. If you go to a facility and you say, here I am, the special rapporteur, and can you let me in? They don't know, they try to buy time. So you have to be on the one hand also polite, on the other hand you have to be effective. That's often not so easy. So in a police station I would say immediately, I want to go down to the cells, because I don't want that they tamper with the evidence and they bring the tortured people away, as happened quite often. I go first to the disciplinary cells, because these are the people that might have been ill-treated because they are the difficult prisoners. So there are all kinds of methods. Where do you carry out the interview is very important, because if the prison director says, here is a beautiful room and we have prepared it for you and we bring you the prisoners, you can be sure that there is somewhere a monitoring camera. So the best thing is to ask the prisoners. They know themselves quite well where they are not monitored. And that can be outside, can be even in the cell. The usual cells are not monitored, and then I send out the other prisoners and I stay alone with the person who does the interview. I also always had a letter of authorization in the language of the country by the highest authorities, the Minister of Interior, the Inspector General of the Police, the Prime Minister, whoever, that I can show in the language as soon as I arrive at a prison or a police station or a psychiatric hospital, saying, I have all those rights, I bring my whole team and I have the right to confidential interviews. That helped a lot, as helped the 24 hours telephone line with the highest authorities in case that there were any kind of problems. As you see on this atlas of all my fact-finding missions, there is a certain high amount of countries in the Asian region, Central Asia, it was Kazakhstan, but then Mongolia, China, Nepal, Papua New Guinea, so also in Indonesia, Sri Lanka, so also countries that were at the time in an armed conflict. I had also one Arab state, Jordan was the only one that actually accepted or invited me to come. I had 4 European countries, 2 of the European Union, that is Greece and Denmark together with Greenland, and 2 outside of the European Union, Moldova and Georgia. In Africa, it was difficult to get the invitations, but we had a big state like Nigeria, but also one of the worst states in the world is Equatorial Guinea, Togo. We did a joint investigation in Sudan. And in Latin America, also only a few countries like Uruguay, Paraguay, Jamaica as a Caribbean island. But we also did the Guantanamo investigation for Cuba. So I think it is a fairly representative sample of countries. In only one of these countries, I didn't find any serious allegation of torture and no proof of torture, and that was Denmark and Greenland. At the same time, the country with the highest standard of conditions, of prison standards. All the others, including the European states, I found torture, sometimes not on a regular basis, individual cases, but definitely more than 50% of all countries in the world, torture is a routine and widespread practice by the police and other security agencies. So that's more than Amnesty or others would have expected. And in more than 10%, it's systematic torture. That was in my case only 2. Nepal, at the high time of the civil war, the conflict between the kings still and the Maoists, etc., when the political parties were prohibited, it was really systematic on the side of the Maoists, but also as much by the military, by the police, by the armed police. So that's why I say it's systematic. It's a governmental policy. And the same was in Equatorial Guinea, which is one of the worst dictatorships in the world. And again, everybody whom we interviewed who was in police custody was actually tortured, heavily tortured. So those were the 2 worst countries that I visited, and I show you at the end also a few photos. Like in Sri Lanka, usually the prisons are always better, because there you are already convicted, and in most countries these are open prisons. People go around and are not really put in their cells as they are in China or in the United States of America. In the middle you see the Colombo pre-trial detention center, and that's what I mean with overcrowded. And these people don't only stay for 2 days, they stay for many weeks. And they have no beds or mattresses, and it's totally overcrowded, and they have to sleep in shifts, etc. The torture room in Nigeria was one of the worst that I ever have seen. It was in the major criminal investigation police center in Lagos, in Nigeria, and it was very difficult to enter, but then we finally could, and those were about 120 people, men, but also small children, 14-year-old children, 3 women who were all heavily tortured in front of the others. And that was also, my forensic doctor said, the worst that he has ever seen. There were people dying while we were coming because they were shot from short distance into their legs. That's at that time was a classical practice of the police for people who were suspected of having committed armed robbery. And then they let you without any kind of medical treatment, and the flesh is simply rotting, it's infected. You cannot imagine what these people have suffered. Some of them we could still save their lives, others unfortunately died. They closed down this, of course, and we brought many people to the hospitals. But for us it was a very, very bad experience. Nepal, I said already, very bad. In the middle you have very strong reactions of electric shocks. Usually that is only leaves very, very little marks. But in Nepal, because of the skin, it might also leave other marks. On the right-hand side, it's the military. It is boxes like saunas with up to 60 degrees Celsius, where people are locked in for 4 days. On the left side, the main station, police station, Hanumantoka in Kathmandu, totally overcrowded. In the same building, in the basement are the cells, in the second floor are the police chiefs, and on the top floor are the torture rooms that we found. Indonesia was also a difficult country, were sometimes so overcrowded that you couldn't really do individual interviews. Jordan was the only country in the Middle East that allowed us. On the right-hand side you see Al Jaffa prison in the desert, which was one of the worst, where everybody was beaten up. And you can see very well the scars, and the forensic expert what caused this kind of injuries. On the left picture you see Palestinian hangings that leaves here very strong marks when people are handcuffed in their bags and then suspended from the ceiling. It's excruciating pain on your soldiers, and then often these people are then still tormented with electric shocks. So all that can be documented. As I said, China was a particular problem in Tibet, but also in the region of the Uyghurs at that time already. Mongolia was quite bad. They had the death penalty, one of the worst conditions on the death row, but they later, also on the basis of my report, abolished the death penalty. So that certainly, Mongolia certainly is a country that improved. Equatorial Guinea, I said already, is one of the worst countries in the world. Togo was much better, but you have children also in prisons because the minimum age is 7 years. But for the rest, we felt that the situation had improved in Togo, and we didn't really find very serious cases of torture. And this is Greece in 2010. And already at that time, the conditions of migration detention in these police places and makeshift prisons were outrageous. The smell and the overcrowdedness, many children, was as bad as in many African prisons. And that is Denmark. That looks totally different. In Denmark, people are in this little apartment and they are actually locking the apartment from inside and not the prison guards from outside. Even men and women can be together if they want, so that is a much better situation. The same in Greenland. People are even during the day going out and working, and in the evening coming back home to the prison, so it's a much more relaxed situation. So the conclusions is, as I said already, torture is widely practiced in the great majority of countries around the world. Most of the 173 states parties to the Convention Against Torture have not really implemented their obligations. Every state can eradicate torture, and Denmark is a good example, but you need the political will to do that, and this political will is missing. The main reason also, I should say, is corruption, the non-functioning of the administration of justice. If you have money, you can bribe yourself out of police detention or out of prison. You will not be tortured. If you're poor, then you might end up for the rest of your life in somewhere as a forgotten prisoner. As I said, there's a global prison crisis. And I really advocated for a UN Convention on the Rights of Detainees. That didn't come about, but the standard minimum rules for the treatment of prisoners were actually amended. They are called now the Mandela rules, and they are better. So there's a lot of improvement, for instance, to reduce the time for solitary confinement, etc. So the standards were actually improved, but the situation as such, the practical situation, is still very bad. So I hope I could give you a basic introduction what torture means, how it actually should be combated in order to prevent it, but also what is the reality on the ground on the basis of my personal experience as a special rapporteur on torture. I thank you very much for your attention.